Good afternoon. My name is Richard Hunt. I'm the director of the Center for Legislative Archives at the National Archives, and I want to extend my welcome to the audience here today in the McGowan Gallery, as well as to the National Archives YouTube channel audiences. I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs that will be held here in the McGowan Theater. Tomorrow, Wednesday, June 13th at noon, historian John Reeves will be here to discuss and sign his latest book, The Lost Indictment of Robert E. Lee, The Forgotten Case Against an American Icon, which tells the untold story of the legal and moral case made against the Confederate general after the Civil War. On Friday, June 15th at noon, we'll screen the new documentary, The Hello Girls, which tells the story of America's first female soldiers, the 223 women in the U.S. Army Signal Corps sent to France as telephone operators to help in the fight in World War I. Following the screening, director James Terez and historian and author and NAR staff member Mitchell Yockelson will discuss the film and answer audience questions. To learn more about all of the public programs and exhibits at the National Archives, please consult our monthly calendar of events online at archives.gov. Check our website or sign up to get email updates. You'll also find information about National Archives programs and activities there as well. We are very fortunate today to have Dr. John A. Lawrence at today's author's lecture. John served for 38 years as a staff member in the U.S. House of Representatives, the last 8 as Chief of Staff to Speaker and Leader Nancy Pelosi. Upon his retirement in February of 2013, Speakers John A. Boehner and Mrs. Pelosi conferred the John W. McCormick Award for Excellence for John's dedication to the House and to bipartisanship. John also served as the Democratic Staff Director of the Committee on Education and the Workforce and the Committee on Natural Resources, as well as Chief of Staff and Legislative Director to the Congressman George Miller from California. John played a major role on legislation in the areas of health policy, education, labor, budgets, national parks, energy, and child policy. John has a PhD in history and currently serves as a visiting professor at the University of California's Washington Center. He is also an appointed member of the Advisory Committee on the Records of Congress, which provides guidance to the National Archives and my center on the preservation and management of the official records of the United States Congress. John is the author of The Class of '74, Congress After Watergate and the Roots of Partisanship, which Kirkus Review called, quote, an essential work of congressional history. And congressional scholar Norm Ornstein described it as a landmark volume on congressional history. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, Politico magazine, among others, and he's appeared on NPR, C-SPAN, and PRI International. Following his lecture and audience question and answer, Dr. Lawrence will be signing copies of his book, One Level Up, in front of the Archives bookstore. John, could you please join us? Extend a warm welcome to John Lawrence.
Thank you, Richard and Tom Nastic. Thank you to the archivist for honoring me with his presence, and thank you to all of you for braving the caps. I thought they were for me, but I did think it was a little odd that they were all wearing red. But it was. I really appreciate your coming, and I hope you both enjoy the lecture. And I'd be happy to respond to some questions after I talk. I spent the hour that I got here. I got here a little early also because of my concerns about the crowds for the demonstration, not for the book talk. And I spent that time going through the Vietnam exhibit here, which if you haven't seen, I would strongly recommend you're doing. That's a period of time that I remember quite vividly in my own life when I was in college and graduate school. It also coincides with some of the time that this book takes place. And so for me, it was a very powerful exhibit. And it was also very helpful in terms of putting me into the proper frame of mind for this talk. Let me describe to you our, see if this political environment sounds similar to you in some ways. So there's a controversial president in the White House. There is an election in which he was elected where there was discussion about tampering with the election, about people trying to get into computer systems and interfere with the election. As a part of the response to that, there's a special prosecutor in the Department of Justice who's looking into allegations of election interference, but also potentially problems involving the White House staff and even the president himself. The president's personal attorney, has been accused of making payoffs to individuals in order to buy their silence and ensure that they will not testify against the president or anybody in the administration. The president himself is engaged in reaching out to an isolated communist country that has recently acquired nuclear weapons to see if it can't negotiate some sort of an arrangement with them to lessen international fears. There's a long, protracted, unpopular war, which the American people increasingly are divided and displeased with. There's anger at executive actions by imperial president who seems increasingly imperial and ignoring the historic role of the Congress. Congress itself is largely inactive. For some reason, doesn't seem to be able to perform its constitutional functions. In fact, it's only a few years earlier, a member of its own body, Senator Clark from Pennsylvania, had described it as the sapless branch of government. And then in the winter in western Pennsylvania, there's a special election in the House of Representatives. And the person who wins that election is a Democrat, even though it's a seat that has traditionally been a Republican seat. The Democrat is an untraditional Democrat. He's an Army veteran, not very common nominee of the Democratic Party. And when he wins this election, a lot of electoral observers say, you know, there may be something happening here in terms of a wave election that's going to impact the fall. So that all sounds pretty familiar, except I'm talking about 1974. All of those events occurred in the lead up to this very, very crucial historical election in 1974. And it's the parallel there that I think really is powerful to people, because this book tries to do two things, and I'll get into this a little more later. It both tells the story of this election in 1974, who the participants were, what they did, and how their victory changed the Congress. But it also talks about how in those changes, Congress changed itself, and the nature of government changed, and the nature of American politics changed. And we can trace many of those changes back to the mid-1970s with this election and the environment in which this election takes place. Now, I want to say, for those of you who are scholars, some of this may, of Congress, some of this may already be familiar, but I do want to say to those of you who are not that among historians, and I count myself as one, studying Congress is a tough thing to do, and there aren't that many people who do it. People who study Congress tend to be political scientists, and they tend to spend most of their time crunching data, but not telling stories that historians are trained to tell. And there are some reasons for that. Historians and political scientists, people who write about politics, tend to focus more on presidents. And for an obvious reason. Presidents are one person. They run the entire branch. There's only one of them. They're not 535. Their records are protected, at least when they're not being torn up and thrown on the floor the way apparently they are now. But in any event, you can go and find the president's records. They're very nice. They're protected under federal law, and they're usually in libraries that conveniently bear the name of the president whose records you're going to read. Whereas in the case of Congress, we have 535 people, and they're constantly changing. There are people coming and going at least every 2 years, sometimes more frequently, larger numbers than people think, dozens of new members of the House, and usually more than a dozen new members of the Senate every 2 years. It's one of the reasons that governing the United States and congressional action are so difficult. And all these people are, number one, difficult to find their records. In doing this book, I interviewed over 40 members of the class of 1974, as well as other members, staff, officials of the Congress, reporters, and others who were around at the time. And usually when I would ask them if I could look at their papers, their answer was, I don't know where they are. They're probably up in the attic, or maybe they're in the garage. I'll go look for them. And I know, as Richard mentioned, I now serve on a group that tries to get members, and we're doing a much better job, I think, to preserve their records. But 40, 50 years ago, a lot of these records were not preserved particularly well. And in part that was because many members didn't serve for very long, and they didn't see their papers as having any particularly great significance. And so it's very hard to find those papers to begin with. The other question is, who speaks for the Congress? I mean, do the leaders speak for the Congress? Does only the majority? Does the minority? Does the House? Does the Senate? And even if you were to decide that, maybe it's the chairman of the committees, well, that all may change in 2 or 4 years, and now you have different people and different records. So it's a challenge to study the Congress, and for that reason, people tend to study the presidency. And just this year, we've seen new biographies of William McKinley. We've had new biographies of James Buchanan, even Millard Fillmore, Chester Arthur, but very, very little that's ever written on Congress. In fact, in the 70-year history of the Pulitzer Prize for History and the Bancroft Prize, which is the big history prize, no one has ever given an award for history of the Congress. We've had histories of slavery, we've had a history of presidents, we even had a history of the cigarette, but we've never had anybody win for the history of the Congress. Even the official, well, I think it's a semi-official history of the House of Representatives by Robert Remini, a distinguished Jacksonian historian, who later served as the historian of the House. Over 500 pages, less than a half a page is devoted to the class of 1974. And that's kind of significant because Norm Ornstein, one of the leading congressional political scientists, calls it the most significant historic class in the 20th century. And yet only a half a page is paid to them. So it's a challenge to study. I was very lucky. I think because I started working in Congress in '75, I knew many of these people when they first got there. They were able to talk to me and open up to me and share their thoughts. And throughout this book, although there's plenty of other archival and secondary sources, I really try to let their voices speak, their anecdotes, their recollections, their analyses of what they think they were doing, what they wanted to do, and why they ran for Congress. So they view this, both the time they served and particularly the class in which they served, as very unique. Tim Wirth, who was elected in this class as a member from Colorado, later went on to the United States Senate, called it a glory time. And Les O'Coin, who came from Oregon, a seat that had never before elected a Democrat to the House of Representatives, called it a hinge point in history. It's also, I think, the key period of time for understanding how we began to grow a much more polarized, much more divisive, partisan politics in this country. Not simply because of what this class represented or what this class did, but because they existed at a time when many other social and political forces were being loosed in the society, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I go along. Typically, when this group of people is studied, this class of '74, they are dismissed as the Watergate babies. And the story is told that they were rambunctious, they misbehaved, they didn't respect the institution. They came here, they sort of acted impetuously in very self-serving ways, and then the story sort of disappears, and their historical significance is lost. And much of that account is actually not true. or is misunderstood. And that's what I try to tease apart in this book. Now, it's not surprising that a lot of the negative views of this class came from the people who were the established powers of the Congress at the time that they arrived. And let me say, this is a large group of people. They picked up 49 seats in 1974. There were 76 new Democratic members, 93 new members overall. So it's a large congressional class. And when they come to town, they are viewed as a very different group of people. They're young. They are predominantly liberal, although not exclusively. And they don't necessarily act and behave like many of their peers. The book actually starts with a story about one of these members, Tom Downey from New York, being misidentified by a senior member as a page on the floor of the House of Representatives. The pages were supposedly 18 years old. And that's how stunning it was to have some of these folks in the Congress. Tip O'Neill famously said that, oh, these people they had 1 million grievances. And a Republican leader at the time was even less restrained. He said they were wild, they were uninhibited, they were downright rude, intemperate, and immature. So they didn't get a warm reception right off the bat. And to some extent, they perpetuated that sense of themselves. Toby Moffett, who was one of the freshmen from Connecticut, said, we were young, we looked weird, I can't even believe we got elected. So let me deal with some of these impressions that I try to correct in this book and give you a better sense of who these people actually were. One is that I think that what is often viewed as intemperate behavior, disrespectful behavior on their part, actually was a reflection of impatience. And they were impatient because they were drawn into government service, they were drawn into politics as a result of issues that they felt deeply personally about and that they felt that the Congress was not responsive to, particularly civil rights and the war in Vietnam. When I asked most of these members of Congress, why did you run for office in 1974? What impelled you to run? Fully expecting from the historical record that the answer was going to be, well, Congress was the stultifying autocratic institution that really just needed reform. In fact, virtually nobody said that. The only two people who said that were the two people in the class who had PhDs in government. Everyone else said, no, I didn't really know that much about reform. I didn't realize there was a long history of reform. I didn't know what the problems were. I ran because I wanted to end the war in Vietnam. That was, by and large, the dominant reason that these members ran. And it was true on the Democratic side as well as on the Republican side. Of course, there were some who were just graduating their way up from other offices. But in fact, the compelling issue that drove most of them to Washington was Vietnam. But they weren't disrespectful to the institution itself. They were predominantly Democrats. They were predominantly liberal and people who wanted to use government to accomplish a whole series of goals, whether that had to do with energy or civil rights or women's rights or the environment, certainly ending the war in Vietnam, reforming the Pentagon, improving higher education, advocacy for the disabled or for children. There was a long litany of issues that drove these people into public service, and virtually for all of them, you needed a credible, functioning federal government. And I do make the point in my talks a little more than I do in the book itself. I think it's one of the distinguishing features between current groups, waves of government. They are coming from a more conservative point of view who don't necessarily have that same underlying concern about maintaining and enhancing the reputation of the federal government. This group did need to do that. It was not in their interest to tear down government. They were very much there to reform the functioning of government so that it would be able to address what they saw as being the urgent issues. But they didn't know what that meant institutionally. In fact, reform efforts had been going on in the Congress for almost 2 decades by the time they arrived. which is why it was somewhat startling that most of them said, I didn't know anything about that. I've actually had a number of members, after they read the book, call me up and say, oh, well, now I understand what was going on when we got there in 1975. Even this late, 45 years later, they still didn't fully understand what had happened. Beginning in the late 1940s with the election of lots of newer, younger members, veterans who were coming into the Congress, there's a desire to open the process up. Congress is a pretty stultifying process. Since the revolt against Cannon in 1910, it's a committee-based government and committee-based Congress, and the committees are run by chairmen, and the chairmen are determined by the seniority system. And the seniority system, which itself was a reform back in 1910, is a system that lets you gain and maintain your role as the absolute chair of the legislative committee as long as you can breathe, and sometimes not even breathing particularly well. There are a number of cases like that. But this was the honored system that was adopted because it was viewed as neutral. You didn't just get to be chairman because you were the friend of the speaker or because you shared the speaker's political objectives. But over time, of course, that system, a system that's based purely on tenure of office, benefits people who have a tendency to get reelected. And you have a much better chance of getting reelected if you don't have to run against anybody as an opponent. That tended to overwhelmingly benefit people in that region of the country where there wasn't an opposition party, which is the South. So that by the time you get to the late 1940s, the 50s, certainly into the 60s, well over half of the chairmanships in the House of Representatives are from the South. And they tend to be very old. They tend to be among the most conservative people in the Congress, teamed up with Republican conservatives, and of course there's much greater ideological variation within the parties at that point. The parties have not ideologically sorted. Those conservative Democrats and the bulk of Republicans form what's called the Conservative Coalition, which effectively prevents legislation from passing, much progressive legislation from passing. It was only by making deals with that conservative coalition that FDR was able to get through, for example, the New Deal with virtually no attention paid to civil rights. And the same was true in the 40s and in the 50s as well. The reformers look at this system, they say, well, this has to change. I mean, these guys are way too powerful. They're increasingly out of kilter with the liberalizing trend of the Democratic caucus, and yet they retain disproportionate power. They hire all the staff on the committees. They designate the subcommittee chairman. Legislation does not go to subcommittees. It goes to the full committee, and only goes to the subcommittee if the chairman decides to send it to the subcommittee. The chairman decides who serves on the subcommittees. The chairman decides whether or not a subcommittee can hold a hearing or whether a subcommittee can mark up and pass a bill. So there's this total power that is lodged in less than 24 people, and most of them are increasingly out of touch with the caucus that doesn't select them, but that ratifies them as the chairman. It is not unusual by the late 1960s for a majority of the chairmen of the Democratic caucus to vote against the Democratic Party's official position 80% of the time on the House floor. So this tension begins to grow. By the mid-50s, there are reformist groups that are forming in the Democratic caucus. There's a group by Jimmy Roosevelt called Roosevelt's Raiders. There's a group that Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota forms called McCarthy's Marauders. And they evolve in the late 50s into something called the Democratic Study Group, which is set up largely as an organization, not entirely by Democrats, interestingly, and not entirely liberals, although the Republicans did not want to be noted, those who were members, as a means of providing information to the members as to what they were voting on. This is, remember, again, for those of you who view the Congress today, this is a little difficult to understand. In those days, there were not recorded votes in committees and subcommittees. There weren't even recorded votes on the committee of the whole, which is where most of the legislative business of the House takes place. These were secret votes. The committee meetings were not open. There was no television or radio coverage of hearings or of the floor. This was a largely secretive operation where the power was so maldistributed that members would actually quit. And I quote some of them in the book, just say, I just can't, I came here to do something. I didn't come here just to wait for somebody to die so I can move up, one slot and then wait another 20 years for somebody to die and then I can move up another slot. So these reformers were pushing and pushing. There were some reforms that were done in the legislative reform in the late late 40s, and then another Legislative Reform Act in 1970, and a subcommittee Bill of Rights in 1973. But they weren't enough to really break the power of the chairs and of the conservative coalition until 1974. Now, I do want to give you an idea. When I say they were conservative, let me give you an idea of why the tension here built. So the chairman of the Armed Services Committee is a man named Edward Hebert. He has been chairman for a long time. He's from Louisiana. He's a staunch segregationist. He's very pro-Vietnam, very pro-Pentagon. He will broach no one on his committee who will disagree with him on any position. He will not allow you to offer amendments. He will not allow you to he will not take up any legislation. And in 1973, this is now the Vietnam War is obviously winding down, but he is now faced with two people who want to be on his committee. A freshman woman from Colorado named Patricia Schroeder, who is a pilot, Harvard Law School graduate, very interested in the military, and a very left-wing second-termer, Ron Dellums from Berkeley, California. They want to be on the party. Dellums is African-American. He says, I think it's, since 40% of the people dying in Vietnam are African-American, maybe it would be nice to have an African-American on the committee. There had never been one, never been a woman. And Hebert says, no, I don't want any of you. You're not coming on my committee. I'm not having any anti-war people, and I don't want you types on the committee either. For reasons that I go into in the book that I don't have to bore you with right now, they do get on the committee. And when he is organizing the committee for the first day, Hebert assigns all the committees on the day, all the seats on the dais. And when they get to the very end, he says to Schroeder and Dellums, I don't consider you two to be full members of this committee, and so you'll have to share a chair. Okay, this is 1973. I asked Pat Schroeder, what did you do when he said that? And he said, we shared a chair. That was, he also refused to allow her to go to the Paris Air Show, a typical trip that members of the Armed Services Committee would take. He said, because I'm not signing a travel voucher for any damn woman to go to Paris. So this was the kind of obdurate, autocratic governing that members were rebelling against, except that when you faced this problem in the Democratic caucus, you just didn't have enough votes to force any change. And then, as Bella Abzug said, the reinforcements arrive. This class of 1974 comes in, there are 76 new Democrats, and suddenly, for the first time since World War II, really the first time since 1910, there is a progressive majority in the Democratic caucus. So what are they going to do? Well, first of all, most of these members, as I mentioned, didn't have a clue what they were supposed to do. They didn't know about the seniority system. They didn't know about Roosevelt's Raiders and McCarthy's Marauders. They didn't know anything about the Democratic Study Group. That's not why they ran for Congress. They didn't run for Congress to reform the institution. But they're quickly told by the reformers who do exist, people like Dick Bowling and Philip Burton and Don Fraser and Bob Kastenmeier, look, whatever it is you're interested in doing, whatever reform policy you want to see implemented, it's not going to happen unless you change the seniority system, because you're never going to have a chance to raise these issues. And so they do throw out three chairmen. Our friend Mr. Hebert was one of them. Bob Pogue, chairman of the Agriculture Committee, was one, and Wright Patman. Now, interestingly, and this is where the historical record is wrong on the popular history, they do not throw out every Southerner, and they do not throw out every conservative. Moreover, people who replace, so the person who replaces Edward Hebert is a conservative. He happens to be from Illinois, but he's a conservative Democrat as well. So it's not an ideological purge. The purge tended to go against people who were extremely autocratic, who did not allow younger members to fully participate. And the importance there is that not only did they throw out the three, but they sent a message now that these rules that had been on the books but had been honored in the breach, which was that the caucus had to approve of the chairman, now that was going to be a real process. In fact, the chairman called in the chairman to tell them before the vote, why should I vote for you to be the chairman of the committee? That never happened before, right? It was this seniority system. He said, I'm the oldest guy I'm going to get lunch. Just tell me when I'm the chairman again. And in fact, they sent a note back to the freshmen who had organized into something called the New Members Caucus. They said, we're not coming to talk to you. You're not even members of Congress yet. Okay, and so the freshmen sent a note back, said, well, that's fine. Then we won't vote for you and you won't be the chairman anymore. So they came, all but one. One was too sick to come, but he got reelected anyway. But they came, and Hebert, for example, famously put his knuckles on the table when he was introduced and said, okay, boys and girls, let me tell you how this place really runs. That didn't do him very much good when it came time to vote. So they voted 3 of them out. But what's really important to note is that between that vote and the next vote 2 years later, 6 chairmen retired. And another 2 were out for other reasons, scandal, and one was defeated. So that by the time you begin the 95th Congress in January of 1977, you have more than half of the committee chairmen are new. And they know that their ability to hang on to the chairmanship is tied to their ability to take care of the caucus and to respond to the demands of all the members of the caucus, not simply their friends, not simply their delegation, not simply their peers, but that diversity that the caucus is increasingly coming to represent. So that's one of the really important things to realize about this class. It did not arrive as reformers. It became reformers when they got here, because they joined what they had not even recognized was an ongoing movement to modernize and make the system more efficient, more democratic with a small d, and more transparent. Another common misunderstanding about this class is that it was just a group of young, wild people, and that they were very, very undisciplined and unaware of political behavior, political etiquette. That's actually not true. Half of the class, which is about the same as the remainder of the caucus, had served in political office. Paul Simon had been lieutenant governor. Les O'Coin had been the majority leader of the Oregon legislature. Tom Downey had served in the local state government, even though he was only 25 years old. Elliot Levitas had served in the Georgia legislature, as had John Jenrette and Butler Derrick. There were 5 mayors who had served from California, including people like Norm Mineta, Jerry Patterson, Mark Hannaford. So there was a lot of electoral experience in this group. However, one of the things that is important is that among those who had not held political office previously, and this has some resonance today with some of the new candidates we see running, there were people who weren't necessarily they didn't necessarily have electoral political experience, but they were very political. Many of them came out of the civil rights movement. They came out of the student movement. They came out of the consumer movement, the environmental movement. They were press savvy. They were organizationally savvy. They knew about building coalitions. They knew about building grassroots and fundraising. And that means that they came into an institution that honored a lot of the traits that they had. Now, they were impatient. There's no question that they were tired of legislation, whether it was on Vietnam or civil rights or environment or energy policy, dragging indeterminately for a very long period of time. But they brought that kind of expertise and they brought that kind of experience. I think that those early characterizations, however, of them just being, Tip O'Neill famously said, who are these people? They never walked a precinct. They never showed up at a headquarters. That's just not true. There were some. Bob Edgar, who was a minister in eastern Pennsylvania, literally had to look up Democratic Party in the Yellow Pages to go down and find out how he could run for Congress. He had no political experience at all. Gary Myers, a Republican in western Pennsylvania, when he ran the first time in '72, went down to take out papers, and they just assumed that he was taking out papers for the incumbent congressman because nobody had run against him before. But Gary was a steel worker in a steel mill in western Pennsylvania. So there were some of those, but there were lots and lots of people who had other experience. I think that characterizations helped to trivialize the historical reputation. It's why I object to the term Watergate babies so strongly. I think it's meant to infantilize them and to really suggest that they had no sophistication and no politics. And that's really not true. Their goal, and they joined this large representative reformist group of people who were already members of the Congress, their goal was to open this institution up. And in that, they largely succeeded. They were very heavily criticized by particularly the press early on for not having greater legislative success, which I think is an unfortunate burden to put on them, because the issues that they were trying to deal with, they were very complicated issues. I mean, national energy policies remember, this is only a couple of years after the first oil embargo. We're talking about deregulation issues, interstate issues. You have oil influence, money playing a huge role in the process. The notion that within 6 months, David Broder of the Washington Post is saying, well, these people are complete failures. They've failed to do what they wanted, what they said they were going to come to Washington to. Well, they didn't say they were going to come to Washington and completely change these intractable policy issues which had been so difficult. They said they were going to work on those issues, and they considered themselves to have been largely successful. For example, they did in April of 1975 vote to cut off funding for the war in Vietnam. They considered that an enormous act of political success. They were able to pass legislation having to do with higher education. They did pass a major energy bill in December of 1975. Didn't go as far as many people wanted, but it did, in fact, establish, for example, CAFE standards from auto efficiency, something that had been frustrated for many, many years. So I don't think they certainly did not share this notion that they were unsuccessful. They did often express disappointment, however, that when they moved to the legislative side of their agenda, they were much less unified and much less successful than they had been when they addressed the reform area. Because they obviously were all, being junior members, they all had common interests in reform that would allow younger members to participate and would make the institution a more transparent institution. When you got into complicated political issues, whether that was education or whether or not that was energy or that was labor policy, then the same sorts of political considerations that were going to affect everybody else were going to affect them, and there wasn't as much unanimity of feeling, and they expressed concern about that. But they did, in the course of these deliberations, they were very successful in opening the institution. A great deal of power, for example, was disseminated down to the subcommittees in many different ways. Number one, the subcommittee chairman gained huge amounts of autonomy through the Subcommittee Bill of Rights in 1973. That now got implemented to ensure that younger members were able to select subcommittees before senior members gobbled up all the good positions. And in doing so, they populated these subcommittees with large numbers of reformers so that, for example, the Subcommittee on Energy and the Commerce Committee was able to really play a fundamental role in shaping the energy legislation of 1975. They made sure that the subcommittees were able to do their own hearings, that they got more of their own staff. They weren't dependent upon the senior chairman to give them their staff. They could originate hearings without getting the permission of the full committee chairman, and they could move legislation into the full committee's jurisdiction by passing it at the subcommittee level, something that was very, very difficult to do beforehand. So by allowing more of the younger people to move into substantive positions, including very soon chairmanships, actually some became chairman their first term, and by moving legislation through the subcommittees where the full committee membership was loath to ignore what the subcommittee had done because A, those are people who are going to elect the chairman the next time, and B, if you ignored this subcommittee, they might ignore your subcommittee when you produce legislation. So the empowerment of the subcommittees and the autonomy of the subcommittees became a very important operational change in the Congress. It's often what is pointed to in a negative way as disseminating power so broadly that it was impossible to manage. My personal sense from looking at the record is that's largely, that's largely exaggerated. The committees remained quite functional and quite productive. On a personal level, I think what happened was that people lost some of the deference that they were used to being given, and they objected to that and translated that into policy grounds. One of the areas that the class was very good at, and that is one of the areas of deviation, I think, from past political behavior was that they were told right at the outset, when they first arrived, you have to focus specifically on getting reelected. The reason they were so sensitive to that is that a decade earlier, in 1964, there had been this huge election. Lyndon Johnson had defeated Barry Goldwater by a record number at that point, and there was this enormous class of Democrats who were elected to the House of Representatives. It's that big cohort of membership that allows the Great Society to be enacted over that period of time. But in 1966, only 2 years later, there's a Republican resurgence, and many of those Democrats lose their seats, and in fact, most of the Great Society legislation is dissipated at that point. And you only have one major piece of legislation, a public housing bill in '68. Most of everything we think of as that Great Society era can be pretty much compressed into late '63 after the Kennedy assassination and the election following 1964. So as these people arrived in '74, they're very aware, and their leaders are very aware of the fact that you're in a highly vulnerable position. Obviously, you've won 49 seats that were Republican seats. You're worried, how am I going to be able to hold on to them? And from the day they get there, they're told, pay attention to your home district, go home, and utilize whatever resources you have to make connections and maintain close connections with your constituency. And wisely, from the standpoint of these incumbents, the House leadership agrees with that. And the House Administration Committee significantly ramps up the amounts of money that can be spent on staffing and on travel. Their approval is made for early technological equipment like mag card writers and fax machines. They're given Watts lines, low-cost federal lines that allow them to communicate with their district. And more of these members are going back and forth to their districts and appearing in their districts, mailing newsletters. The number of newsletters, the number of the franking privileges are significantly increased so that they do not face the same kind of fate that their peers in 1966 did. And in point of fact, in 1976, the first election after the wave of 1974, only 2 members of this class are defeated. And one of them was because of a scandal, and the other just lost. There are a number of others who leave. They leave to run for other office. But the retention rate is phenomenal, particularly given the fact that you had picked up such an enormous number of seats that in many cases had been in the Republican camp for decades. Those people get reelected. As a result of that, these members themselves in this class that came in fighting the seniority system start to see some of the benefits of seniority. They start moving up. Large numbers of people move out of Congress. They move into their seats. And by 1982, which is only a few terms, obviously, after 4 terms after they first arrive, there are half of the classes gone through attrition, either because they ran for other office, but also you did have the Reagan resurgence in '80 and '82. You had a lot of conservatives running in districts that these Democrats had sort of marginally hung on to, and they don't hang on quite so well in that wave election in 1980, when the Senate does in fact go Republican. But of the 42 who remain in 1982, of the 42 who remain in the House, all but 3 of them are either subcommittee chairmen or members of exclusive committees. So they have moved with enormous rapidity into positions where they are playing leadership roles within the caucus and within the House itself. Now, obviously I don't want to go into all the details. There's many, as I say, additional accounts of particular legislation, particular individuals' recollections in the book itself. But one of the second half of this book I do want to take a couple of minutes and talk about, because I've sort of told you the good side, I think, in that there's this large group of people. They come in, they really force change to the institution, they open it up, more transparent, more democratic dissemination of the use of power. And that really does allow a lot of issues to emerge, and it allows a lot more people to participate. But as is often the case in politics, and I think in probably life too, there are unintended consequences to your success. And I don't argue in this book that the reforms that were enacted, implemented by the class of 74 with the support of the class of 74 caused partisanship. But I think it's pretty clear that in a political and social environment in which very divisive issues are rising and where there are significant political and social changes emerging, such as the reemergence of a Republican Party in the South for the first time really since the 1870s, a very prominent role played by evangelical movements, the rise of private money, the rise of conservative grassroots organizations, that the reforms that open the institution also provide handholds for political groups that don't necessarily share the same viewpoint as these more liberal reformers to be much more effective in the articulation of a political point of view and also strategically. And I talked with a number of Republicans who served then and staff friends of people who were friends of mine or people who I've worked with who said, yeah, these were very conscious decisions. We realized that, for example, by reforming the rules so that people were more able, members were more able to raise objections, raise amendments, because the changed rules gave more staffing to the minority, because we were able to raise issues on the floor and in committees, we effectively exploited those to raise issues that we knew would prove most problematic and most troublesome to that marginal group of Democrats who we thought we might be able to defeat, and in defeating, put in play the House of Representatives. It's very important to keep in mind, from 1932 to 1994, Republicans were in control of the House of Representatives, a period of 62 years. They were in control of the House of Representatives for 4 years. So 58 out of 62 years was Democratic control, albeit largely because of this large block of Southern conservatives. Once that conservative Democratic hold breaks down in the South, and those conservatives, particularly white conservatives, start to move into a revitalized Republican Party, as African Americans following the Voting Rights Act move into the Democratic Party, the parties come into more parity. And once they come into parity, and Frances Lee, in a great book called Insecure Majorities, has written about this. She's a political scientist at the University of Maryland. Once you're in parity, once you're fighting for control, particularly in a place like the House of Representatives, where being the majority is everything, there's much less reason to collaborate. There's much less reason to find common ground. There's much less reason to cross over. And you do find during this period of time, the late 70s, not only within Congress, but as a result of voting finance reform, campaign finance reform, the rise of private money, the increased role of political action committees, the rise of grassroots-based organizations, you find the mechanism for fighting that battle on a much more partisan level. That could be prevented in an earlier period because people couldn't raise issues. You didn't have opportunities to offer amendments, just like Hebert hadn't allowed the anti-war folks to offer amendments when he had his defense authorization bill. But now you have a more open process. And then you have the happy development of technology through cable, through talk radio, then ultimately through the internet for more voices that are unregulated by the kind of autocratic and organized control that had previously characterized government to enter the fray. And so it's not, my point is not that reform in and of itself causes the rise of partisanship, but it clearly, by allowing a more open institution, it clearly provides a mechanism for that fight to take place. And it's largely on the part of the Republicans because the Republicans are understandably struggling to win political power. But there are plenty of forces on the Democratic side, too, that are at odds with their own leadership or taking dissonant points of view and are using these greater, more liberalized, more participatory rules to fight these battles out on the floor. And so you see this enormous explosion on the number of amendments from a couple of hundred during the session to close to 1,000 in the session. Many of them are targeted around issues that are specifically selected to create political opportunity, whether it's abortion or busing or school or draft card burning, or prayer in school, or the MX missile, or gun policy. These all start emerging as favorite amendments of the political strategists on the floor, because in using them in a more open, more accountable way, they become viable political weapons for fighting at the edges of each caucus, and therefore fighting for political control. So just in conclusion, and then I think I'm probably around my time, I would just say, I think that one of the important lessons of this book and that I think has a very contemporary ring to it, is that the institution of Congress, and predominantly I'm writing here about the House of Representatives, it can be easily misunderstood. The institution is very much shaped by the people who are in the institution and who are running the institution. That's not to say there aren't important rules changes. Some of these are. But the nature of the debate, the tone of the debate, the nature of the relations between individuals and parties, and the way in which issues are raised, a lot of that is due to the people who come into the institution. This class of '74 radically changed that conversation in 1975 and 1976. And whether or not it's predictive of what may happen down the road, I will leave to people who see the future better than I do. So with that, I'm going to stop and thank you for your participation, and I'm happy to respond to some questions. I've been asked to ask you, if you want to ask a question, to go to one of the microphones so that the folks who are listening online can also hear the question. So I'm happy to take a question. I always point out to people I worked in Congress for 38 years, so there's nothing you can say that's going to insult me or upset me more than has already happened. I'm happy to respond. Yes.
I'd like to ask you a question about kind of your research process. You talked a little bit about interviewing the 40 different individuals and that the papers were very difficult to find. But were there items in the archives here or other collections that you were able to use?
Yeah, and I used particularly, I found some great materials in Carl Albert's papers. Albert was was the speaker. He sort of took the brunt of the criticism of the class. His papers are at the Carl Albert Center at the University of Oklahoma. Again, this is a period before emails, and so people were they used letters. I'm here dealing with letters from members to him, for example. As he became the subject of criticism, people would be quick to write letters to dissociate themselves from the critics. So you would have a group of members who would complain that he wasn't bringing the legislation up fast enough, or that he wasn't responsive enough. And then there were actually some stories in mid-1975 about how maybe he should be moved out. Bob Carr, who was a member of Congress from Michigan in 1975, actually went on the Today Show and said, I think Albert should step down. That caused this flurry of letters to be flooding into Carl Albert's office saying, that's not me. I'm not, don't look, not all the freshmen feel that way. So those were helpful. But for the most part, I talked to a member 2 weeks ago, because he's moving, and this is a member who has a pretty good sense of history. He's actually writing a book of his own. And he said, I was up in the attic the other day and I found a whole cache of my papers I didn't even know were there. And this is somebody who is attuned to it. So it's tough to, it's tough. I looked at committee records because I look in the book specifically at several bills as representative of the divisive nature of the legislative debates. I look at the Citus picketing bill in 1975-76, and I look at that energy bill pretty carefully. So committee records were really important too. The other, I used obviously the library, the manuscript division has some important materials, but particularly Democratic caucus records, but some of the best material I found in the Democratic caucus was actually in the drawer of a former parliamentarian in his office in the basement of the Capitol. I pointed out, this is Charlie Johnson. I said, Charlie, I don't think that's where it really belongs. You need to send that somewhere else. But as a result, it was great for me because I was able to report on an incident that a pretty important one that happened in the caucus that no one had ever heard about. Yes?
Yeah. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. I just wonder, since the 70s, citizens' correspondence or communication to the three branches, are those maintained in the archive or in their three branches separately?
So,
and whether there's any change since then until now?
I think there's a big change between then and now. I mean, one of the values of serving on this commission that I do is that I see how much attention is being paid to working specifically with member offices as well as committees. Committees are a little different, to preserve those records. A lot of times members, I think in the past, would get rid of correspondence because they viewed it as personal and they didn't think that people would want that information available. So it was very haphazard. I think it's done a lot more systematically today, and obviously it can be valuable. It's hard to evaluate when you're looking at correspondence how representative it is of what constituents think, but it's certainly a good way of hearing what the members were hearing. Again, this group that I'm dealing with was very diligent about it. In fact, not only did they get correspondence, they solicited it. They used to send out newsletters that would have little tear-off polls that people would send back saying, I'm really interested in education and environment. Supposedly that was, we're taking a poll to see how you care about that. But it was really to build these mailing lists, which was possible to do once you had computers and mag card writers and the ability to do that. So that correspondence changes to some extent with the technological changes of the 70s. But it's real hard to find. And the other part that's really difficult, I should just add, is that even when you have members who have been farsighted enough to save their records, if they have put them into a local library, for example, usually the library will not catalog that material unless the member goes and raises the money to catalog them. Well, the member, having left office, is certainly not interested in raising money. That's part of the reason they probably got out of office in the first place. They were tired of having to raise money. So a lot of times the records will just lay there, even in very reputable libraries. Records, I don't want to name names, but I would go and look at records and they'd say, well, here are 75 boxes, start looking. It's just not feasible. So fortunately, the archivists in the House and the Senate are now much more diligent. They meet with members when they first arrive. They certainly meet with people when they announce that they're leaving and try to get those records maintained either in physical or electronically for future researchers.
So you know anything about White House correspondence and the judicial?
My understanding is that the White House, it's all governed by the Presidential Records Act. So I think that stuff gets preserved. I think that's right. I don't know how the judiciary works.
Thank you.
On that. Anybody else?
Hi, Lucia Graves with The Guardian.
Hi.
Less than 6 months out from midterms, I'm a journalist, so I'm thinking in election cycles. We have a lot of people running for office for the first time, a lot of women running for office for the first time. Are there takeaways from this era for people who are running for office now?
I think that I'm asked that question a lot. What can they learn right now? I think that there are some significant differences between now and then. I think since the 1970s, there's been much more emphasis on the nationalization of congressional elections. So you see really since 1994, since the contract with America, and actually there was an effort to do that with the Republican leadership. Bob Michael did something similar years before the contract with America to try to cast the congressional elections in a national frame. I think in the 70s, they were very local. They were very personal. The parties very often did not recruit these candidates. They certainly did not give them their messaging. Whereas today, you're very dependent upon, you feel like you're part of a national story. So I would say one thing that remains the same, however, is this focus on your relationship with your constituents. And over and over again, you just ask Eric Cantor or anyone else who sort of surprisingly loses their seat. The constituency is very highly attuned to what's going on and what you're doing, and because of changes, I think, in telecommunications, they're much more expectant that you're going to stay in close touch with them. So certainly one of the pieces of advice the class of '74 was given, as I mentioned in the talk, within the first couple of weeks they were there, was set up a very aggressive communication effort with your district. And I think that's the same message that people will get here. To some extent, I guess people say that's something that's wrong with Congress, is that they're always just looking over their shoulder and they're worried about their constituents. But I mean, that is sort of inherent in the nature of representative government that you are. So certainly one advice I would give is, make sure that you build a very strong constituent network. The other thing that is I don't think it was planned in a sense, but you saw it particularly among the people who were more successful. And so I think of it as a general rule, more successful in the class 74, and that is try to figure out what area you want to be expert on, and don't try to be everything to everybody. Don't have something to say on every single issue. A bunch of them wanted to be known for consumer policies, or for energy policies, or environmental, or education, or children. And they really concentrated on those areas, became expert on them, got on the right committees, introduced legislation, worked with interest groups, and they built their own credibility within the institution, as opposed to just being a gadfly and having something to say on everything. And I guess the third is, and this comes out of the experience of the New Members Caucus, which it was the first time there had ever been anything created like the New Members Caucus. It hung around, incidentally, until 1979, which led Tip O'Neill to wonder, why are these people still new members? Because they've now been here for 3 terms. But it's the personal relationship. There were people who told me that they would go to the floor having to vote on an amendment, and even if it was an amendment they didn't especially agree with, very often if it was offered by another member of the class of '74, they would vote for it because they felt this very strong personal bond. And what I find, both in my research but also in my experience of being in working in the Congress for so many years, is that personal connection is hugely important. And so I would always advise members to figure out how not just to become part of their state delegation or their regional, or not to get ideologically isolated, because the most successful legislators invariably tend to be people who, I don't mean are social butterflies, but I mean who make a point of meeting and working with and collaborating with and other members. I think it's tougher now to do that across lines because we've become so deeply polarized that reaching across to work collaboratively with other members is very often a dangerous thing to do. Whereas it was not in the 1970s. There were still large components of conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, so it was easier to be collaborative. But to the maximum extent you can, figuring out how to build those personal relationships is really critical. And when you talk to members who served back then and contrasting what it's like today, it's amazing how quickly they will mention the breakdown in personal relationships as being something that's fundamentally changed the institution and made it less enjoyable. It was really, I think, important, whether it was playing handball in the gym or going on a trip or having their families live here because they were working lengthier periods of time so that you wouldn't just constantly be running back to the district. All that's changed. And it's those personal relationships I've always found that when you do get to a crunch, that's when you do need to be able to fall back on those to build alliances. So I think those sort of things. Pay attention to your districts, build personal alliances, and try to do some specialization. I think would all be good pieces of advice this class would relay to the people who are running now. Anybody else? No? Okay, well, thank you again very, very much for coming. I guess we'll be signing books outside if you're interested. Thanks very much.